The night Caspian left, the palace smelled of rain and cold stone. She did not slam any doors. She did not leave a note. She folded her one good dress into a worn canvas bag, tucked her mother's silver ring into the inner pocket where it would not be found if the guards searched her at the eastern gate, and she walked out of the Alpha King's chambers the same way she had walked into them 18 months ago, quietly, without ceremony. With the full knowledge that no one of consequence would mark her passing. She was wrong about that last part. Caspiel had been brought to the palace the way most Omegas of poor standing were brought to royal courts, as a solution to someone else's problem. Her village, a scatter of farmsteads 3 days' ride into the foothills, had fallen behind on its tithe. The magistrate had come in autumn with 2 guardsmen and a list of names, and Caspian's had been on it not because she was special, not because anyone had selected her with any particular care, but because she was unmated, of age, and the village elder had calculated that losing her would hurt the community least. She had not wept when they took her. Her mother had wept enough for both of them, pressing the silver ring into her palm and whispering things about stars and patience, and how someday the shape of her life would make sense to her. Caspian had kissed her mother's forehead, shouldered the canvas bag, and climbed into the magistrate's cart with the particular stillness of someone who had already made peace with the fact that peace was not something the world offered her in large quantities. The palace was enormous in the way that things built to remind you of your smallness are enormous. Caspian was processed through 3 different offices, catalogued, assigned quarters in the lower servants' wing, and given a position in the kitchens before anyone looked her in the face long enough to notice anything about her at all. She worked. She was good at working. She learned the rhythms of the palace kitchen, which head cook liked silence before noon, which undercook responded well to flattery, which doorways led where, and which guards changed shifts at what hours. She learned the layout of the palace the way she had always learned difficult terrain, by moving through it patiently, without drawing attention, letting the geography reveal itself. She had been there 4 months when the Alpha King noticed her. King Erevan Ashcroft was 29 years old and had ruled for 6 years following his father's death, which was 5 years and 11 months longer than the court had privately expected him to last. He was not beloved in the way that soft kings are beloved. No one wrote ballads about his gentleness or told stories about him freeing prisoners at festivals. He was respected, which was something colder and more durable. He made decisions quickly and lived with their consequences without visible regret. He had the particular stillness of someone who has learned that stillness is more frightening to enemies than noise. He had come down to the kitchens because he could not sleep, and because the head cook kept a specific tea on the 3rd shelf that helped with the headaches he pretended not to have. He had come down 3 times before without incident. The kitchens at that hour were empty except for the banked fires and the smell of bread dough rising under linen cloths. On the 4th night, Caspian was there. She was sitting on the stone floor with her back against the cold hearth, reading. She had a stub of candle balanced on her knee, and a book open in both hands, one of the botanical texts from the lower library, which she had borrowed with the quiet persistence that had become her signature method of acquiring things the palace did not officially offer her. She did not hear the king enter. She was reading about the medicinal properties of foxglove with the total absorption of someone for whom books are a form of escape. Erevan stopped in the doorway. Later, much later, he would not be able to explain what it was about that specific image that lodged in him the way a splinter lodges, too small to remove cleanly, impossible to ignore. A woman reading about foxglove by candlelight on a kitchen floor, her dark hair loose around her shoulders and her feet bare against the cold stone, utterly unbothered by the hour or the chill or the strangeness of it. It was absurd. It was nothing. It was the most quietly extraordinary thing he had seen in 6 years of looking at extraordinary things. He cleared his throat. Caspian looked up without flinching, which was unusual. Most people flinched when they realized they were alone in a room with the king. Caspian simply looked at him with the mild, assessing attention of someone deciding whether this new variable required adjustment to her current plans. "You're in the kitchen," Erevan said, because apparently that was the sentence available to him. "So are you," Caspian said. It had not begun as anything grand. Erevan came back the next night, and the night after. Caspian was not always there, but when she was, they talked haltingly at first, then more easily, in the particular shorthand of 2 people who have both learned that silence is often the safer option, and are therefore slightly drunk on having a conversation that does not feel dangerous. Caspian was direct in a way that the king's advisors were not. She disagreed with things. She said that seems wrong, without following it with elaborate apologies. She asked questions that were not rhetorical. She forgot, sometimes, in the low light with tea cooling in her hands, to position herself the way an Omega woman was supposed to position herself in the presence of an Alpha King, deferential, contained, careful. She just talked. Like a person. Erevan found himself rearranging his evenings to account for the possibility of kitchens. By spring, Caspian had been moved to the king's personal household staff, which was the official version of something that was becoming, quietly, significantly unofficial. By summer, she had been moved again into rooms adjacent to the royal suite, which the court noted with raised eyebrows and lowered voices. By autumn, the rooms adjacent had become unnecessary because the distance between them had collapsed entirely. No one announced it. The king did not make declarations. Caspian did not receive a title or a formal designation. She was simply, inexplicably, constantly present, sitting at Erevan's desk while the king reviewed correspondence, reading while Erevan met with advisors, asleep in the king's bed when the candles went out. The court did not know what to make of her. She was a tithe Omega from a hill village with no family name worth speaking. She wore no jewelry except a plain silver ring on her smallest finger. She had no political usefulness that anyone could identify. She did not maneuver, she did not compete. She made no alliances and pursued no advantages. She simply existed, close to the king, with an ease that the most elaborately trained courtiers could not replicate, and the king was different. Easier, still formidable, still sharp. But there was something in him that had loosened, and everyone in the palace could feel it without being able to name it. The way you can feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. The ladies of the court watched her with a particular combination of curiosity and bafflement. She owned no gowns worth noting. She did not play the social games that occupied most of their days. She walked through the palace as though she had mapped it herself and found it unintimidating, which, in fact, she had and did. Several of them tried to befriend her, sensing influence in her proximity to the king, and found her pleasant enough and entirely impossible to leverage, which made her both more and less interesting depending on the woman. What no one saw what happened only in the sealed privacy of those rooms was different from the official silence. They argued, sometimes Caspian had opinions about the tithe system that were pointed and personal and expressed with a specificity that could not be dismissed as abstract philosophy. She had been the tithe. She knew exactly what the ledgers felt like from the sight of the name on the list. Erevan listened. Not always immediately. Not always without pushing back, his jaw tight and his voice carefully level in the way it got when he was receiving information that required him to revise something he'd already decided. But he listened. There were nights when Erevan came back from council with the headaches bad and sat on the edge of the bed with his elbows on his knees and said nothing for a long time, and Caspian would sit beside him and say nothing either, because she had learned the way she had learned everything about this strange, immense life that Erevan's silences were not absences, but presences. And they required company, not filling. There were mornings when Caspian laughed genuinely, unpracticed, startled into it by something small, and Erevan would stop whatever he was doing and just look at her with an expression that the king himself seemed unaware of, something open and wondering and slightly lost. The expression of a man who has spent his entire adult life in a landscape of granite and has just found, inexplicably, a garden. Caspian saw it. She always saw it. She tucked it away with the silver ring and her mother's voice and all the other things she carried in the places that didn't show. She was, she knew, extraordinarily good at carrying things in places that didn't show. Her whole life had trained her for it. The daughter of a hill village widow learned early that legibility was a liability, that what could be read could be used, and what could be used would be. So she had learned to hold her most important things inward, folded tight, the way seeds hold everything they are through winter. She had not expected the problem to be that she would need to unfold. She left on the night of the first autumn frost, when the palace smelled of rain and cold stone. She had been thinking about it for 2 months. Not because anything had changed between them, that was not the reason, or not the whole reason, and she needed to be honest with herself about that as she moved through the dark corridors with her canvas bag and her careful feet. Nothing had soured, nothing had broken. Erevan was not cruel to her, had never been cruel to her, and that was almost the problem. The problem was that Caspian was beginning to understand what she was to Erevan, and the shape of that understanding was comfortable in a way that terrified her. She was a comfort. a constant, something that had slipped through all the official structures of the palace and wound itself around the king like a vine finds the cracks in stone, not by force, not by plan, but by the patient. Directionless persistence of something that simply wanted to grow somewhere warm. And Erevan had never in 18 months of nights and mornings and arguments and silences said what that was, had never named it. Had never reached for it directly and said, "This is what you are to me, this is what I am asking of you, these are the terms." Because naming it would make it a thing that could be examined. A thing that could be weighed against the other things a king must weigh. Caspian understood politics. She had not lived in a palace for 18 months without learning how the machinery worked. She knew that a king's companion, an unmated Omega from no family, brought as a tax payment was not a simple thing to formalize. She knew there were lords who would object, alliances that might shift, a court that had already spent a year and a half cataloging everything it didn't understand about her. She was not naive. But she was also not willing, anymore, to be the thing that was kept because it was convenient. She had waited. She was patient extraordinarily, almost painfully patient. Forged by a life that had never given her the luxury of expecting anything to arrive on her preferred schedule. She had waited through the spring and the summer and the early autumn, and the thing had not been named, and she had begun to understand that the silence was not caution. It was comfort. Erevan was comfortable. The situation was comfortable, and comfortable things do not get examined, because examination carries the risk of change, and kings, even good kings, even kings who had loosened something real and stopped flinching from windows, do not easily choose change when the present arrangement is functioning. Caspian was not a hostage, and not a consort, and not a servant, and not a guest. She was a comfort. She deserved, she had decided, to be a choice. So she left. Not in anger, not with ultimatum, not in the dramatic fashion that the novels her mother used to read aloud would have prescribed, the tearful confrontation, the declaration, the demand for acknowledgement. She left the way she had survived everything else. Quietly, without ceremony, in the full knowledge that no one of consequence would mark her passing. The Eastern Gate Guard barely glanced at her. She was no one. A Tithe Omega from the hills in a worn coat with a canvas bag, her hair braided back for traveling, her face composed in the neutral expression she had perfected over a lifetime of moving through spaces that did not welcome her. She walked into the dark and the cold and the smell of rain, and somewhere behind her in the palace, the king slept. The king did not sleep for long. The detail that would later be told and retold in ways that became increasingly embellished was this. Erevan Ashcroft woke at the 4th hour of the morning before dawn, before the fires were stoked, in the deep dark before the palace stirred, reached for something that was not there, and was on his feet before he was fully awake. This was not a king who operated on instinct. He was a man of deliberate action, careful assessment, measured response. His generals had built entire tactical frameworks around his predictability. His advisors relied on it. The court trusted it. He searched the bed. He searched the adjacent room. He searched the private corridor, the small sitting room where Caspian sometimes read until late. He found the botanical text from the lower library sitting open on the desk, foxglove. Always foxglove. He had never asked why foxglove specifically, and now the absence of that question sat in his chest like a coal, and he stood in the cold, dark room for 30 seconds. Then he went to find his head of palace security, and caused something that was later diplomatically described as a significant mobilization of royal resources. By dawn, the palace was awake. Not because anyone announced it, not because any official order went out, but because 4 different captains of the guard had been roused from their beds, because the stable master had been asked urgently about the Eastern Gate logs, because the head of the household staff had been called to the king's chambers in the dark, and had emerged some minutes later, looking shaken in the particular way that people look shaken, when they have just been asked questions by someone who is controlling themselves with visible effort. The kitchens caught word first, the way kitchens always do. Then the lower halls. Then it moved upward through the palace the way heat rises through the servants' quarters, through the domestic staff, through the lesser attendants, through the edges of the court, until by the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge, there was not a person within the palace walls who did not know that the Omega woman was gone and the king was looking. The ladies of the court, who had spent 18 months watching Caspian with guarded curiosity, now watched the king with something closer to stunned reckoning. Several of them had underestimated her. Several of them had assumed that the king's interest in the girl from the hills was the interest of novelty charming, temporary, destined to run its natural course. They were revising that assumption with some haste. What they did not have was the word frantic, because no one who was present for it would have dared use it to describe the king's behavior. But the word existed in the spaces between what was said, in the way the stable-master's hands shook when he told the story later, in the way the gate guard who had waved Caspian through at the third hour stood very straight and answered questions very carefully and requested 3 days off afterward. Erevan did not shout. He was never reported to have raised his voice. But his stillness in those hours was the stillness of a different kind, not the stillness that controlled rooms, not the measured quiet that made advisors careful. This was the stillness of something load-bearing, something under extreme pressure, maintaining its form through sheer refusal to do otherwise. He sent riders east, west, north, and south within the hour. Not soldiers, this was a point that the messengers were very specifically instructed to clarify at every post they passed through. The king was not pursuing a fugitive. The king was not acting in official capacity. The riders carried no warrants, no authority of crown, no instruments of arrest. They carried a description the Omega woman, Caspian, from Vale village in the northern foothills, canvas bag, silver ring, dark hair braided back, reads while walking, and a request, plain worded, that anyone with information contact the palace at their convenience. The Lord High Chamberlain, a man of 60 years who had survived 4 monarchs and believed himself beyond surprise, watched this unfold from the edge of the throne room and revised several foundational beliefs he had held since youth. By mid-morning, the King's Council had assembled itself in emergency session. Because the King's Council assembled itself in emergency session any time the word emergency appeared within earshot of any of its members, which was its primary function and one it performed with genuine enthusiasm. Lord Halverson, the senior advisor, opened the session with his customary authority. "Your Majesty, the situation requires— I know what the situation requires," Erevan said. He was standing at the window. He had been standing at the window for some time. The light fell across him wrong, too pale, too raw, the light of a man who had not slept and was not bothering to arrange his face. "The court will have questions," Lord Halverson continued carefully, because he was a man who had learned to treat silences as potential traps. "About the individual in question. About the nature of her role here. She has a name," Erevan said. Halverson paused. "Yes, about Caspian." "The court will wish to understand what they will understand," Erevan said, turning from the window, "is that finding her is the priority. Everything else is secondary. Your Majesty, with respect to the optics of mobilizing royal resources for the recovery of an undesignated Omega, she is not undesignated." Erevan's voice was entirely level. "She is he" stopped. And in that pause, in the way the pause landed, the entire council became very quiet. "She is mine," Erevan said. "She has been mine for 1.5 years, and I failed to say so, and that is why she left. That is the full extent of the political situation. Does the council have questions?" It was not phrased as a question. The council did not have questions. Lord Halverson did permit himself one observation, very quietly, to the council member seated beside him, as the king left the room. "I think we had all better get accustomed to the idea of a queen." Caspian had made it to the relay town by mid-morning. She had walked through the night not hurrying, not fleeing, just the steady ground eating pace of someone accustomed to covering distance on foot. She was cold and tired and felt something complicated in her chest that was not regret, exactly, but was its neighbor. She sat down in the common room of a way-station inn, ordered porridge and hot tea, and sat with her bag in her lap and her mother's ring on her finger, and tried to decide what came next. She had not thought extensively about what came next, which she recognized was a flaw in her planning. She had been very clear-eyed about the reasons for leaving. She had been less clear-eyed about the destination. The Vale foothills, eventually, her mother's house, her old life, whatever shape that took now. She had been gone 18 months, and the village would have reorganized itself around her absence, as villages do. She would find work. She was skilled at finding work. She had, after all, turned herself from a tithe payment into someone essential to the running of a palace, which was not nothing, even if the palace had never quite figured out how to classify what she was doing there. She was halfway through the porridge when the innkeeper came to her table with a careful expression. "Begging pardon," the innkeeper said. "But there's a rider outside asking after someone matching your description. From the palace, it seems. He's made a point several times, actually, and with some emphasis of saying he's not here to take you in. Just asking if you might be willing to hear a message." Caspian looked at her porridge. She looked at the ring on her finger. "What does the message say?" she said. The innkeeper unfolded a piece of paper. The handwriting was not a scribe's clean copy. It was the handwriting of someone who had written this personally, in haste, in the dark, the letters pressing hard enough into the page to leave impression. It said, "I have been an idiot. I know why you left. I am not asking you to come back for my comfort. I am asking you to come back because I intend to be specific, which I should have been a year ago, and you deserve to hear it from me, directly, not from a rider. But I have sent the rider because I cannot bear the idea of you not knowing I am looking. Come back, or don't. But know that I am looking." Caspian read it twice. She folded it and put it in her inner pocket, beside the silver ring's original casing, beside her mother's dried lavender sprig, in the place where she kept the things that were too important to be anywhere accessible. "Tell the rider," she said, "that I'll finish my porridge." She did not go back immediately. This was important. She walked for another half day, because she needed to think clearly, and she thought clearly when she was walking. And she needed to be absolutely certain that what she was walking toward was the thing she wanted, and not the thing she was afraid of wanting. She needed to be certain that she was choosing, not returning. The distinction mattered enormously. She had spent her whole life being moved by other people's choices, the magistrate's list, the palace's assignments, the invisible tidal pull of an alpha king who had rearranged her orbit without asking. She was going to walk back through those gates on her own 2 feet because she had decided to. Or she was not going to walk back at all. She sat on a hillside in the afternoon light and thought about Erevin's hands when he was focused on something the way they stilled completely. Everything concentrated. She thought about the sound of her name in the dark, said the way Erevin said it, not a summons, not a title. Just the name itself, with a quality she had never quite been able to categorize. Caspian, like something he returned to. She thought about the Foxglove book left open on the desk, and how no one would know why Foxglove, that she had started reading it the week after arriving at the palace because it had been her mother's, because it was familiar weight in unfamiliar hands, because some part of her had needed something from home in a place that was nothing like home, and she had never told Erevin that, and Erevin had never asked. And now there was this piece of her that the king did not have. And that was the rest of the problem, wasn't it? Not just that Erevin had not named it. Caspian had not given him all the pieces either. She had been careful, strategic. Patient, she had offered warmth without vulnerability, presence without history, herself without her story. She had held back the mother, and the ring, and the foxglove, and the magistrate's cart, and she had offered Erevin a woman to be comfortable with, and then felt quietly betrayed by being made comfortable. She had withheld herself, and called it self-protection. And it genuinely was. But it was also, she could admit now, in the honest silence of a hillside in the afternoon, a kind of test. She had been waiting for him to reach past the composure and find the person underneath it, the way she had always hoped someone would eventually bother to reach. He had not known there was something to reach for, because she had never showed him the outline of it. She sat on the hillside for a long time. Then she stood up, shouldered her bag, and started walking back. Erevin met her at the gate. Not in the formal sense, there was no ceremony, no assembled court, no official processional. But Erevin was at the eastern gate when Caspian came through it in the late afternoon with her worn coat and her canvas bag, and the look on the king's face was not one that would be described in any official record. They stood 6 feet apart in the slanting light while the gate guards found urgent reasons to look at other things. "You came back," Erevin said. His voice was careful, which meant he was not trusting it entirely. "I hadn't decided to," Caspian said. "I've decided now." Erevin absorbed that. "Good, that's not enough," Caspian said. "The message said you intended to be specific." "I do. Then be specific." The king looked at her, really looked, the way Caspian had only seen a handful of times, the open, wondering look that Erevin didn't know he had, and said, "You are not a comfort to me. Or, you are, but that's not the right word." You are the person I have arranged my thinking around for 18 months without naming it, because naming it meant asking you to stay for real, and I was afraid you would say yes for the wrong reasons and I didn't know how to ask for the right ones. He paused. I'm asking for the right ones now. I want you to stay because you choose it. Because it's what you want. I want you to be my another pause. I want to be specific, he said again, like he was reminding himself. I want you beside me, formally, named, with the ring and the ceremony and the title and everything I should have offered you a year ago instead of just he made a gesture that was helpless in a way Caspian had never seen him be helpless. Instead of making you comfortable. Which I understand now is not the same thing. Caspian looked at him for a long moment. The late light was catching the gray at his temples that hadn't been there when she arrived 6 years of kingship, written in small increments. She had watched it happen without saying so. There's a book in your study, she said. About Foxglove. Erevan blinked. Yes, I started reading it when I first arrived because my mother had a copy. I was homesick and I needed something familiar. I never told you that. No, Erevan said slowly. I'm telling you now, Caspian said, because that's what I want. I want you to know things like that. I want to tell them and have them matter. I don't want to be comfortable. I want to be, she looked for the word. Known. I want to be actually known. I want that too, Erevan said. I've wanted that. I didn't know how to ask for it without I am not good at asking for things directly. You sent 4 riders before dawn, Caspian said. Yes, that seems fairly direct. That was desperation, Erevan said, with a precision that was almost funny, almost aching, entirely him. Desperation is easier than asking. Caspian was quiet for a moment. Then something in her chest, the complicated thing, the neighbor of regret, shifted into a different shape, lighter, still complicated, still bearing the weight of everything the last 18 months had been and everything they hadn't. But lighter. Okay, she said. Erevan looked at her. Okay, I'll stay, Caspian said. Formally, named, with the ceremony and the title and everything, eventually. But first she reached into the inner pocket of her coat and pulled out the folded message and held it out. You should have this back. And then, you should tell me something you've never told anyone. Because I'm not starting from comfortable. We're starting from the beginning. Erevan took the paper. He looked at it for a moment and then, unexpectedly, in the slanting afternoon light with the gate guards staring rigidly at the sky, he laughed. It was a short laugh, rough with disuse. Caspian had heard it maybe 3 times in 18 months, and it was still, she thought, one of the best things she had ever heard. The headaches, Erevan said. The ones I pretend I don't have. They started the year my father died, and I haven't told anyone because telling anyone would mean it showed. It shows a little, Caspian said. I know, Erevan said. They stood in the gateway in the late light, the bag still on Caspian's shoulder, the message between them. The palace, enormous and cold and full of people who had been awake since dawn on their account and would be telling this story for years. The foxglove is good for headaches, Caspian said, in small doses. That's why I was reading it. Erevan stared at her. Were you trying to help with the headaches? I didn't know if you'd let me, Caspian said. So I was reading, waiting to be asked. The expression on Erevan's face was the open, wondering one, but wider now, cracked open further, and he said, very quietly, I'm asking. Caspian shifted the canvas bag on her shoulder. Then, let me in, she said. I'll tell you about my mother. And the ring, and all the rest of it. And you'll tell me about the headaches and whatever else you carry that doesn't show. And we'll actually begin. Erevan stepped aside and opened the gate wider. Caspian walked through. The court noted, in the weeks that followed, that the king seemed different again. Harder to name this time, not just loosened, not just easier, something more complete. He was seen, more than once, pausing in the middle of corridors to listen to something being said to him by the woman at his side, with the focused attention of a man receiving intelligence of great strategic importance. He was seen letting himself be corrected, He was seen, once, stopped entirely at the entrance to the throne room, head bent, laughing at something whispered in his ear, before composing himself and entering. The Lord High Chamberlain revised 3 more foundational beliefs and stopped predicting what the king would do. Lord Halverson, for his part, quietly began the paperwork for a formal designation well before anyone asked him to. The title was official before winter. The ceremony was quiet, which suited both of them a preference for the real over the grand, for the named over the merely present. The foxglove book was moved from the study to the bedroom windowsill where it caught the morning light. Several of the court ladies, who had spent a year and a half underestimating the woman from the hills, now found themselves unexpectedly charmed by her in the way that people who have misjudged someone are often charmed with the particular warmth of surprise and the slight embarrassment of having been wrong. Caspian wrote to her mother. She told her the shape of her life had begun, as she'd promised, to make sense. Her mother sent back a letter that smelled of the hills and said she had always known it would. Caspian kept that letter in the inner pocket, with the ring, with the dried lavender, with all the things too important to be anywhere accessible. Some of them, now, she had taken out. Some of them she had given away. She found, to her surprise, that this made her richer.